You know where you at, Holmes? What's up? You know it's 100 of us in that Cadillac. You know Filipinos, though. Might spill my 40 on the couch, my mom ain't tripping, no. Cause she got plastic wrapped around it like a Kia car. I'm from the blood of savages they brought to world fairs. Chained up to a pole for Caucasians to point and stare scared. The ones who could not drop from calibers the army had. So they made higher calibers, the 45 mag. White flag, drench it in blood until it go dark red. You ain't gon' know till that 100 of us is outside lit ready to bump heads. Hunt heads, the cannibal appetite buried way down in my DNA. Being a G and A targets a DA. Make it unlikely I give a fuck anyway. We up the reason Marines wore leather neck. I'm talking island style, we cut ear to ear, right left. We call that a manila cut necklace. And I bet you my knife click and like one flip you see blades. Then I get Leo hit on you gon' catch a bet that on the West Fade. I'm just saying.
We deliver the slash. We deliver the trash. It has to be perfect.
Well, I guess it's a rap song. You know where you at, Holmes? I'm feeling like Mike Dream holding a Krylon when that mic on. My mama told me that the bishop from the village church took young women to see God, but he would rape them first. I'm such a Debbie Downer, the local out-of-towner. I'm already knowing the issues surrounding the native homies out in Little Earth. The homies in SinCal, the homies who stuck in the federal box but don't know when they get out. I come from claw cut just to scrap against the Spanish sword, and that's been with me since before they cut my mama's cord. This that resistance, I repeat words from my older tracks, and that really ain't different from these other fuckers, dumb rats. Except the shit I say go rally folks like Abby did, Karaja in a Dodger jersey, challenging all of your politics. And when I say Bernie, I mean burn that fucking CBS.
Hello, greetings. It looks like my mic is working. So I hope that you can hear me. Oh yeah, Bird. Hey Bird, good morning, Monica. That was the song I was just playing is by a Filipino artist known as Bamboo. It's called Butterfly Knife. It's about his ancestors resisting imperialism. It's one of the most lit songs that I've ever heard. Thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, Ricky. Thanks for letting me know that you can hear me. Appreciate y'all. Yeah, I was just talking about the song that we had playing at the beginning by Bamboo. I actually want to find it because it's like one of the songs I listen to get hype. When I want to go in against imperialism, when I want to go in against colonialism, I'll listen to Bamboo. He is a radical Filipino hip-hop artist that folks should check out because he's great. He also has another song called Routine that just ends with him saying fuck a cop like 30 times. It's very good. But I put the link to the song I was playing at the beginning of the show in the chat or in the comments. But thanks y'all so much for tuning in. Hopefully you have a day off from capitalist exploitation. This is a holiday we don't recognize because it's a colonizer holiday celebrating the dispossession and genocide of indigenous people. So we don't celebrate Thanksgiving, but we also appreciate the fact that a lot of folks get the day off. So I hope that you're enjoying your day off. I hope that you're doing what you want to do. And I hope that you're finding space and time to reflect upon the struggle against imperialism and colonialism, which you can do a great job of doing by tuning into the show. My name is Onyesanwu. I am a cadre with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. I'm also very tired. I stayed up till like 4 in the morning watching movies. My friend and I watched the Spooky Set by the Door last night at like 3 in the morning, and it was great. So yeah, I'm a little bit tired. I don't really feel well, but I'm very happy to be here with y'all. Very happy that y'all are tuning in. This is the show that All African People's Revolutionary Party New Mexico chapter hosts called Weekly Pan-African News. We do this every single Thursday at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. It used to be 11, now it's 12, lunchtime, because of capitalism. And we started the show back in March because we realized when the pandemic hit that African people in particular were going to be devastated by COVID because we are underdeveloped and we are denied access to medical resources and housing and employment and all things you need to survive under capitalism within this society. And so we were like, we want to keep talking to our people, but we don't want to put them in danger. We don't want to get them sick. And so this show is one of the ways that we developed to continue to connect with our people, to continue to spread political education, spread the line of the Aprp. So we've been doing this since March, almost every single week. I think we only missed it like 2 times. And every single episode of the show We do political education. We do updates about COVID. We do updates about what's happening in Africa and throughout the diaspora. We talk about the organizing that's happening here in Albuquerque and Tiwa territory. It's all around a good time. Like I mentioned, I'm Onisamu. I'm kind of sick. I don't really feel well, but I'm happy to be here. I want to open the show the way that we always do, which is with two things. First and foremost, we as revolutionary African people, as Pan-Africanists, recognize that we are part of the struggle for liberation that has lasted for over 5 centuries, that has lasted for hundreds of years, that started when the very first colonizers set foot on the shores of Africa, seeking to steal our land, seeking to exploit our people. So we understand the work that we're doing right now in 2020 is an extension of that very same struggle that has lasted for centuries. And so we must uplift the work of our ancestors, of the people that fought before us and made it possible for us to be here fighting today. So we do that at the top of every single show. Thank you, Bird. I hope I feel better too. After this, I'm gonna do some yoga and see if I can get my belly together. We'll see how it goes. But so every show, we call in an ancestor to guide our work, to center our work, to acknowledge where it came from. And this week on the show, we actually have a very special, very significant ancestor. I guess they all are. I apologize for putting a hierarchy of ancestors. But yesterday, November 25th, was actually the 4th anniversary of the passing of Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was, of course, the first president of the independent socialist Cuba that arose after the Cuban Revolution. He was president of Cuba for a long, long, long time. He was a beloved leader of that nation and also a revolutionary within that struggle, that successful struggle to free Cuba from imperialism, to free Cuba from capitalism. Fidel Castro was one of the folks that was on the ground in the trenches, organizing the people alongside Che, alongside the guerrillas, to organize the Cuban people for a successful armed struggle to free themselves. And so in the snakes, in the empire, we hear a lot of lies about Fidel Castro, like pretty much constant lies. Like so after the election, which was like a couple of weeks ago, it feels like a very long time ago. It feels like just been like a lot of like rigmarole, like just like ridiculous stuff all around it. It's all like drawn out. So it just feels like it's been months, but it was actually like a couple of weeks ago. The election happened, and then of course, it was much closer than folks anticipated. And one of the deciding factors was, as always in presidential elections in the US, was the state of Florida. The state of Florida went red this year. Folks were like, maybe it'll go blue because the population of colonized folks is so large, but it went red. And one of the factors for it going red was the population of Cuban expats that live particularly in South Florida, who are historically extremely right-wing. And I remember when folks were trying to make sense of why those folks voted like that, they were like, oh, Cuban, those are Latinos. I don't understand. They must be people of color. But if you see them, like if you see the people I'm talking about, like they're not colonized people, they're Europeans. They hate Fidel Castro. But people here are confused about who Fidel Castro was. And so they're like, oh, they must be scared of the possibility of a new Castro rising. And that's why they voted for Trump, because they're afraid Biden's the new Castro. And I'm like, man, Biden and Trump could not possibly be farther from Fidel Castro as a person. Like, Fidel Castro was a revolutionary human being. Fidel Castro was a person who dedicated his life to the liberation of not just the Cuban people, but to peoples all around the world, in Africa and throughout the Western Hemisphere. Fidel Castro, alongside the mass of the people in Cuba, like showed up for the liberation struggle. The people showed up to like help us free ourselves from imperialism. Meanwhile, Biden and Trump are both imperialists, but because people don't understand that those like cracker Cubans who live in Miami are the folks that fled people's justice, are the folks that fled the revolution where Cuba liberated itself because they were going to lose their wealth, and they were like, fuck no, we want to keep our slave money. They fled accountability, and they came here and they've helped for years the United States to attack the Cuban Revolution, and they're extremely racist and right-wing. But people don't understand that because they have internalized a bunch of lies about who Fidel Castro was. They've internalized the lies about him being a dictator, about him being racist, about him oppressing his own people. Meanwhile, when I was in Cuba last summer with the Vencedemus Brigade, we got to see Fidel Castro's like final resting place, like his burial site. And they showed us like this video with this song. I should have played that song in the beginning, actually. It's called Cabalgando con Fidel. It's like a really beautiful song about his life, written by Cubans. And so they played this video about his death and his funeral with the song playing. And it was like probably like, 30, 40 of us in the room. Cubans and people on the VB. And as soon as the video started playing with that song, every Cuban in the room started crying. Like every single Cuban. Like as soon as Fidel's face came on the screen, they were visibly emotional. Like everywhere you travel around in Cuba, you see pictures of Fidel. But they were not put up by the Cuban government. There's no statue of Fidel Castro in Cuba that was put up by the government. All the likenesses you see of Fidel Castro in Cuba were put up by the Cuban people themselves because they love him. They love him. They love him for who he was. They love him for his commitment to them and to their liberation. And they see themselves in him. Like the US has never experienced a leader like that. The US has only had like colonizers and racists and straight up rapists and sexual assaulters as like leadership. Meanwhile, Fidel Castro is this human being who was not perfect, but who so clearly loved his people and loved humanity and felt like a deep solidarity with the oppressed people that continues to this day. That is a model that Cuban people hold up as an example for what they want to aspire to be, for the nation they're trying to build, for the human they're trying to create. So like, yeah, people in the United States do not understand Fidel Castro. They don't. They think they do because CNN lies to them, but they don't. So yeah, the ancestor we want to call in today is Fidel Castro. Que viva Fidel. Unapologetic stan of Fidel Castro. Stay mad. If that makes you mad, just stay mad. Because that man, because that man existed, because the Cuban Revolution happened, we have a much, much, much better chance as oppressed peoples, as colonized peoples, as African peoples, of being successful in our struggle for liberation. Because Fidel existed, we have a much better chance of winning. So I will love that man forever. Almost every single person in the Aprp loves Fidel Castro. I am so sure that there are people watching who are like, I disagree. And I just don't care, y'all. I don't care. Fidel Castro earned this love. He earned this honor. We are so glad he existed. Long live Fidel Castro. So that's the ancestor. And then the other thing that we always do at the beginning of every show is we do a land acknowledgement. We want to, so I'm speaking to y'all from occupied Tiwa territory. Tiwa is the name of the indigenous nation that owns the land that the city of Albuquerque was built on. Despite the fact that European settlers came in and stole this land and built up cities on it and are pretending like it's theirs, it is still in fact stolen. It will always be stolen. The rightful owners are still here. And just like we are fighting to liberate Africa and get our land back and take it back from imperialism, take it back from capitalism, take it back from colonizers, the indigenous nations of the Western Hemisphere, of Turtle Island, of Tiwa territory are still here, are still fighting to get their land back. And if we have anything to say about it, they will get their land back. That is not a metaphor. We are talking about actual material decolonization. And that means that Africa's land will be returned, indigenous nations' land will be returned, Palestine's land will be returned, Ireland's land will be returned, the indigenous people of Australia's land will be returned, land back all over the world. It does not matter how long ago something was stolen. It remains stolen for good until it's taken back and by the people that it was stolen from. So do that every single show. We want to say that we are speaking to y'all on stolen land, especially on this day, this holiday in particular, where the United Snakes, the overgrown settler state, United Snakes of America, created this like completely made up lie about the history of indigenous peoples and European settlers on this land, like created this like fantasy where they were like breaking bread peacefully and like sharing turkeys and like all this kind of shit. Meanwhile, like the arrival of European settlers to this land marked the beginning of an apocalypse for indigenous nations, marked the beginning of an all-out assault against them on an existential level. It was a slash and burn type of war. It was European settlers across classes, like we talked about in the last show, across classes, like attacking indigenous women and children and non-men and elders and destroying their villages and burning their crops and stealing their land and poisoning the water, which they're doing to this day. And so the idea that there's this holiday that's supposed to celebrate like peaceful communion between these peoples, when this nation as a whole would not exist without extreme violence, continuing violence, like the violence is ongoing against indigenous nations, it's like straight up insulting. It's straight up insulting. It's actually really messed up. Like there's no US empire holiday that does not have like that core of like extremely messed upness, and Thanksgiving is no exception. And so we do not celebrate this holiday We move in solidarity with indigenous nations fighting for their land back. We are not going to pretend like this lie that is told about Thanksgiving is the truth. We know how the United States was built. We know what kind of balance it required against indigenous peoples and African peoples. And so we're just not going to pretend like this holiday is anything but an attempt to like paper over that history. But again, if you have the day off, enjoy it. And also, thank you for tuning in to learn about imperialism on your day off. So that's the land acknowledgement. That was the Ancestor. So every single show, we do political education. One thing that you must know about the Aprp is that political education is the foundation of our work. We are a propaganda party. We are seeking to raise the consciousness of the masses of African people and anyone who happens to hear our voices, with the intention of building a movement to destroy capitalism, to destroy imperialism, to destroy colonialism, to liberate Africa, and win Pan-Africanism, one unified socialist Africa. So yeah, every single thing that we do as the All African People's Revolutionary Party has that component of political education. Everything, every event, every internal meeting, every call, we are on that PE stuff. So this week we've been doing like a series of like 101 type conversations where we explain like basic concepts that are core to understanding of revolution, that are core to understanding of like what's wrong with the world right now. Last week we did what is colonialism. We broke down the different kinds of colonialism, neo, cruise, settler. And so this week we want to build upon that conversation with a discussion about what is imperialism? What is imperialism? So we had initially planned to have our comrades from Pueblo Action Alliance join us on the show today. Unfortunately, they are not feeling well, so they will not be able to come through. We hope that they get rest. Like of all days, especially as indigenous people, of all days, like y'all should be able to do whatever the hell you want today. Whatever the hell you want, whatever you want. So like, yeah, absolutely no hard feelings. Get rest, comrades. I hope that you do something you love and enjoy today, and I'm sure that they will join us on the show at another time when they're feeling a little bit better. So I'll be doing it by myself, and I will try to speak slowly, contain the potty mouth, and try to explain this concept of what is imperialism in a way that is easy to understand in an accessible language. So thank you. Wish me luck. Let's get it going. So what is imperialism? What is imperialism? You have perhaps heard that word before. Maybe you are friends with lots of communists on Facebook or Twitter and you see them like ranting about it all the time, but it's like rare. Like I see like people use the word a lot, but it's rare that I see people define it, right? It's kind of like one of those words that's like thrown around, but not really ever clearly defined. So I'm going to make an attempt right now to define it in a way that is easy to understand. So imperialism is a policy or ideology of extending the rule of one nation or empire over other peoples and nations for the purpose of extending the political and economic power of that dominating nation within those subjugated nations. It's basically a practice of extending political and economic access, power, and control through methods such as military force, that people sometimes call hard power. So basically just like sending in troops, sending in drones, sending in tanks, and being like, we are taking over your shit. We're taking over your government. We're going to tell you what to do. Or through soft power. So rather than like outright invasion, rather than like boots on the ground, you are manipulating the economic system in such a way that the country is pressured to do what the dominating nation wants. Maybe you're sanctioning them. Maybe you're funding movements that are seeking to overthrow the government of the nation that you want to control. And maybe you are applying pressure in international bodies like the UN to isolate the targeted nation and get it to do what you want. But basically, imperialism is the practice of extending the economic and political power and influence of one nation, of the empire, upon other targeted subjugated nations, colonized nations. So last week we talked about what is colonialism. So it's easiest to understand colonialism as a tactic of imperialism and a tactic of capitalism, a strategy for that extension of economic and political power and control. I also want to read another quote from a book called Divided World, Divided Class by Zach Cope, that talks about what imperialism looks like in the 20th century, that talks about how in like this particular point in history, the world is basically like globally conquered by a handful of imperialist nations who have divided us basically into these imperialist nations on the top, and then like the vast majority of the rest of humanity on the bottom in like a subjugated relationship to those nations. So this is again from Divided World, Divided Class by Zach Cope. Imperialism is the military and political effort on the part of wealthy capitalist countries to siphon and extort surplus value from subject foreign territories. So imperialism is the military and political effort on the part of wealthy capitalist countries to siphon and extort surplus value from subject foreign territories. So Cope continues, for Marx, the central imperative behind imperialism is not simply to overcome the relative underconsumption of commodities in the metropolitan center, although that is intrinsically blah, blah, but by the need to valorize capital. So that was probably like a lot of like complex language. I'm gonna try to break it down. It's basically the exact same thing I just said. Imperialism is the practice of wealthy nations, wealthy imperialist states, wealthy capitalist states, going to poor states, going to historically colonized nations and attempting to control them politically and economically, but also using them as like new markets in which these like imperialist countries can like pump cheap goods and use those poor countries to generate income, to buy that stuff from them. So it's basically just a situation where the imperialist country, the capitalist country, is seeking to extend its influence to other countries for the purposes of just generating more wealth for the imperialist country's ruling class and for the imperialist country's corporations. It's just a way for the ruling class, for the people on top, for the 1%, for the capitalist nations to generate more wealth for themselves on the back of the vast majority of humanity. So that's imperialism in a nutshell. I'm going to repeat the simpler definition one more time. Imperialism is a policy or ideology of extending the rule over peoples and other countries for extending political and economic access, power, and control through strategies such as hard power, which is again military force, which is like straight up using violence to get people to do what you want, and then also soft power, which is things like diplomacy, which is things like sanctions, which is things like applying manipulative pressure in the political arena to get the targeted country to do what you want. So let me see if that made sense. Let me see if you're in the comments being like, what are you talking about? Monique is saying we're stomping on imperialism. We got lit over here. I agree. Whenever I talk about imperialism, there's going to be a point in this video where I'm yelling because it makes me very angry, because I also know that with enough political education and with enough organization, the vast majority of the people on earth that are being oppressed by the system will be able to take it out. We just have to understand it. We have to understand our own power within it, and then we can destroy it. That's why we do these videos. So I guarantee you, once I get going, I will get lit. Bird is saying, I hope you feel better. Thank you so much. Thank you. I did this to myself, but I appreciate you. Derek saying, watching from NYC. Sorry, Darren. I appreciate you. Also recommending the film Cuba, An African Odyssey. Monique is saying, dispel the myth about me talking about Fidel Castro, and also saying, feel better, Pueblo Action Alliance comrades. So I gave y'all a broad definition of what imperialism looks like in general, and then also in the modern age in 2020, where wealthy capitalist countries are basically using transnational corporations to pump cheap goods into exploited nations in order to open up more markets in those nations, in which wealthy capitalist countries are sanctioning formerly colonized nations or currently colonized nations in order to control their economies, in which wealthy imperialist countries regularly engage in like coups and all kinds of subterfuge to make sure that the so-called independent governments of the subjugated countries are completely beholden to the imperialist capitalist countries. Like I was arguing with someone about, what was I arguing about Honduras and Bolivia, because there's like a certain group of people that believe a coup is happening in the United States right now. And to me, that is like a ridiculous, it's just like an on its face ridiculous idea that a coup is happening right now. Because all I really see Trump doing is filing a series of like dead-end lawsuits that are being denied in court after court after court, and basically just trying to like run out the clock until December, and so he can like keep raising money to pay back his campaign costs. Like that's what it looks like to me. But some people believe a coup is in process, and so this person was trying to tell me that what's happening in the United States is like somehow comparable to what happened in Honduras and in Bolivia. And of course, in Honduras, I talked about this before. My family's from Honduras. My mama lives there. In Honduras, in 2009, the United States orchestrated a coup of a democratically elected president, Manuel Zelaya, who was like a social democrat. He was like Bernie Sanders. Actually, no, he was not like Bernie Sanders because he was anti-imperialist, and Bernie Sanders was not. But he was a social democrat. He was seeking to nationalize Honduran resources and also to build a constituent assembly that would have been made up of oppressed sectors of Honduran society. So like queer and trans people, African people, indigenous people, workers and peasants would have all had representation within this constituent assembly that would have had a say in how laws and the Constitution of Honduras was developed. And so what that represented was a direct threat to the interests of the United States as an imperialist nation, but also to the interests of US and Canadian corporations who wanted cheap access to Honduran resources and labor. They're like, man, you can't have more power over your resources and over the organization of your nation that's going to threaten our access. And so these corporations and the US nation or the US empire conspired to have the Honduran, extremely corrupt Honduran Supreme Court filed charges against Manuel Zelaya for corruption. And then rather than like trying him, instead the Supreme Court directed the Honduran military, which is also corrupt, which is also funded and trained by the United States government, to kidnap Zelaya in the middle of the night and take him out of Honduras to a US military base. They took him out of his bed in the middle of the night and they took him to a US military base. And then the United States, as it does, was like, damn, that's wild. We didn't know that's going to happen. Which meanwhile, like, I would like for you to try to just roll up unannounced to a US military base. There's one here in Albuquerque, in Tiwa Territory, the Kirtland Air Force Base, in the International District. I would like you, as a civilian, to just like try to roll up in there, like in the middle of it, unannounced. Like the idea that this man, Manuel Zelaya, was like kidnapped to his bed and brought to a US military base on a US fucking plane in the middle of the night and the US government didn't know, it's like so ridiculous to me, like on its face. But that was the claim. After he was deposed, the United States was like, what happened? And this happened under Barack Obama when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. And yeah, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama was like, whoo, that's wild. But I guess he's out now, so let's have a new election. Like he had been democratically elected. The people of Honduras never at any point said, we want this guy out. The Supreme Court and the military, who are again controlled by the United States, like funded by the United States, were like, we would. So they fucking took him out. And then the United States was like, we don't know why that happened, but let's have a new election. And of course, the new election was held with massive irregularities. And in Zelaya's place, this dictator, J-O-H, was elected. And this dictator is extremely tight with the US government. Extremely tight. The Honduran government under which this dictator controls is extremely beholden to the US government. It gets millions of dollars in funding from the US government, and that funding is used to train and arm militarized police that have been violently repressing African and indigenous peoples that have been rising up against the dictator in Honduras. So that's an example of a nation that was trying to like flex its independence. I was trying to say, man, we would like to control our resources in a different way. And the United States was like, well, we need that though. And so they just decided to overthrow the president that wasn't going to do what they want and then put in another one that was completely willing to like attack his own people with like dogs and guns and open up Honduran land and resources to US and Canadian corporations. Like where my mom lives is in the Atlantidad department of Honduras on the Caribbean coast in a village called Torna Bay, which is like Garifuna from way back village. So the Garifuna are Afro-Indigenous people, that's what I am, who, you know, when the slave ships came, we like took over the boat, crashed it on St. Vincent, and then settled all over the Caribbean coast of Central America, and we've been there for hundreds of years. And so we have like ancestral ties to that land and like deep relationship with the indigenous nations that are already there. And so these corporations is like beachfront property. It's like very high quality tourist, like highly desired in the tourism industry land. So a lot of Canadian tourism companies that want to open resorts in Honduras have close relationships with Honduran police, who then go into the Garifuna villages and like murder leaders and shoot youth and stuff in an attempt to steal the land. So that's an example of what imperialism looks like in the 20th century. It's basically a way for empires, for imperialist and capitalist states like Canada and like the United States to extend their political and economic influence abroad by manipulating the political process of the targeted nation by funding repressive police and security forces in the targeted nation, by basically using that nation's government against its own people in order to consolidate their control of those resources. Like Honduras is one example. I gave the example of Bolivia, where in 2019, Evo Morales, who was again democratically elected by the people in Bolivia, like the people wanted Evo Morales in leadership. They wanted the MAS party in leadership. But Evo Morales was like, let's nationalize this lithium. Let's give indigenous people their land back. And the United States was like, no, we would like that lithium for cheap, and we would like that land for exploitation. And so we want to orchestrate a coup and install a fascist government. And they just did that. They just did that because that is the scope of the US empire in the Western Hemisphere and beyond. What are y'all saying? Ari, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Miss Garcia or Kristen Garcia. Hi, long-time listener, first-time live participant. So I'm getting a bit confused on the difference between capitalism and imperialism. And then Monica says, imperialism is economic and military power that targets the most impoverished communities, stealing its resources. It's also colonialism. We live in an imperialist state. So it's important to understand imperialism is like basically capitalism on a global scale. So colonialism is a tactic of imperialism, is a tactic of capitalism. Capitalism is private ownership of the mean and production, where the wealth that is generated by the society is privately controlled by a handful of people known as the ruling class, just for the purposes of generating their wealth. And imperialism is that system of capitalism on a global scale, where all of the world's nations are opened up as potential markets, as potential sites of generating wealth for that ruling class. And so they use the tactic of colonialism. They use the tactics of hard and soft power to extend their influence globally. Like, that is what imperialism is. It is the influence of the capitalist ruling class, of these corporations, extended globally to such an extent that there is no nation that exists right now that is not like an open market, like a target for capitalist ruling class in these like imperialist nations. I'm not sure if that makes sense. And if it doesn't, let me know. But I talked about a couple of examples of what, how imperialist countries exert their influence, like spread it across the world. I talked about the coup in Honduras. I talked about the coup in Bolivia. I have briefly mentioned sanctions as a particular strategy of economic control. And so sanctions basically function by strangling the economy of a targeted nation. They're a way of applying pressure to a colonized nation in order to force them to do what the imperialist nation wants. A really, really clear example of sanctions, or a regime of sanctions, is the US blockade against Cuba. The US blockade against Cuba is over 60 years old. It's the oldest economic blockade in the history of the world. It was put in place shortly after the Cuban Revolution was successful. As soon as the United States saw what the Free Cuba was doing, they saw the nationalization of resources, they saw democratic control of the means of production, they saw all of these US corporations being nationalized and the Cuban people taking them back. So as soon as they saw that happening, they were like, we must move to strangle the economy of this nation in order to control, to maintain our interests in Cuba. And so they applied this economic blockade, which basically like dictates like what Cuban can buy from who. It like makes it so people cannot, or it's like too risky for corporations and nations to do business with Cuba. It makes it so Cuba is not able to import like all kinds of things, like medical supplies, like food, like oil. It basically makes it so Cuba is extremely limited in how it is able to import and export the resources it needs to have its economy function. And the intent, again, is to strangle the Cuban economy, to directly target the Cuban people by denying them access to resources that they need to live, like food and medicine and all kinds of things. So yeah, and the intent of sanctions, whether it looks like the Cuban blockade, whether it looks like sanctions on Iran, whether it looks like sanctions against Zimbabwe, when Zimbabwe took back the land and tried to give it back to African people, Zimbabwe got sanctioned. And always the intent of sanctions as a form of soft power is to control the behavior of the sanctioned country, to control the behavior of the colonized country, to manipulate them into acting in a way that is going to benefit the ruling class of these imperialist nations. The imperialist nations want free access to everybody else's land, labor, and resources, and they make sure they maintain that access by attempting to control the political life and economies of colonized nations. And sanctions are a way of doing that. Coups are a way of doing that. Invasions are a way of doing that. So yeah, that's imperialism. Other things to understand about imperialism is that very often people do not recognize that what was done to indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere, like in Turtle Island and throughout this hemisphere, and also what was done to my ancestors, to enslaved African people and the people of the African continent, was imperialism. Like, people do not understand that the very first targets of US imperialism were indigenous nations and African people. Like, the enslavement of my ancestors, the theft of indigenous land, the genocide against the thousands of indigenous nations that existed on this land were all the very first expressions of US imperialism. The US could only become a nation in the first place. The US was only able to become a global superpower because of those very first imperialist attacks against indigenous nations and against African peoples. But people don't usually realize is that when Europeans first came to this hemisphere, they were doing so as part of like almost like corporate industry. They were doing it for like to generate profit, not just like for the crown, but also for like merchants and companies in Europe. Like the transatlantic slave trade, where they enslaved African people and used us to like to produce sugar and cotton and all of these like raw materials that were then exported from the United States back to Europe for manufacturing, and then the goods were exported to like colonized nations for sale and back to the United States. Like, the transatlantic slave trade was the process of how capitalism was spread globally for the enrichment of the ruling class and for the very first corporations. There are corporations that still exist to this day, some of the biggest ones on earth, that only became global entities because of what I'm talking about, because of the theft of indigenous land, because of the enslavement of African people to produce raw materials for emerging capitalism. Like JP Morgan Chase, the bank, the global bank, and Wells Fargo, their very first forms of capital, the very first transactions they engaged in were issuing insurance policies for enslaved Africans, for the loss of us as property in case like we died, the slave owner would get like reimbursed or whatever, and also for slave ships. JP Morgan Chase sold insurance policies for slave ships. So it's very important to understand the transatlantic slave trade as a corporate enterprise, as a capitalist enterprise. It was not just European people being dickbags as they do. It was for the enrichment of private ownership of the means of production of the crown, of these early corporations, of businesses and merchants. It was a corporate enterprise. And of course, that would not have been possible. Like, we would not have been on the land to produce the sugar and pick the cotton and produce these raw materials that were then sold to be manufactured in Europe, if not for the fact that indigenous people's land was stolen. That was the land that shit was grown on. So capitalism could not have become a global system. Imperialism could not become the paradigm today without the very first imperialist strategies of stealing indigenous people's land and enslaving African people to produce the raw materials needed to enrich this system. So hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, comrades. My question is, how do you differentiate between modern imperialism and neocolonialism? I know Nkrumah calls neocolonialism the last stage, but I'm still not clear on this. Definitely get into that. Danny B name drops the East Indian Trading Company, which is one of the corporations I'm talking about that benefited from the transatlantic slave trade. It was one of the corporations on the Europe side who was also in India, flooding India with like the manufacture of goods I'm talking about that were produced by the raw materials that were picked by enslaved African people. There were all these corporations that were like funding European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. Like, it wasn't just European people getting a wild hair up their ass and getting on a boat and sailing to America and seeing what they could see. No, they were sent by corporations to make those corporations money, to steal land and make sure they were getting raw materials and resources to enrich those corporations. The East Indian Trading Company was one of those companies. It was not just the age of discovery and exploration. It was literally companies sending mercenaries all over the world to steal shit and enslave people to enrich those corporations. It was a corporate enterprise from the very beginning. from the very beginning. That's why I'm saying to you, the theft of indigenous land, the enslavement of African people, the colonization of Africa, these were the very, very first strategies of US imperialism, of European imperialism. Understand it as part of the development of capitalism as a global system. Understand it as a corporate endeavor to enrich companies and businesses and merchants. Who else? When Ego says this country also controls the narrative, even I didn't have knowledge about Cuba until a couple of years ago. I knew about Cuba's practices in medicine. That was the only positive thing I learned about Cuba. Now I know the truth about Cuba's uprising goes against capitalism. This country controls the truth. Yep, absolutely. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there's nothing but lies about Fidel Castro. There's nothing but lies about Cuba. And part of the reason for that is because Cuba overthrew US imperialism. Cuba pushed the US empire out of their territory, pushed capitalism out of their territory, began to build a socialist state, began to nationalize the resources of that land. Previously, Cuba had basically been like a US client state, like a resource colony for the US empire that just like produced sugar that enriched US corporations. And then once Cuba took their land back, that was like a bunch of money cut off for the United States. Like they had political and economic control of Cuba before the Cuban Revolution. And so that is what a free Cuba represents. It represents a loss of income for the United States. And it's also an example for all these other nations like Puerto Rico, like Haiti, like, you know, so many nations of the Western Hemisphere that are basically just resource colonies, just puppets, client states of the United States empire that only exist at this present point in history to enrich that empire. So Comrade said, what is the difference between neocolonialism and imperialism? Nkrumah calls neocolonialism the last stage of imperialism, but I'm not clear on this. So like I said earlier, understand colonialism as a tactic of imperialism. Understand colonialism as a strategy to extend this global influence of the imperialist countries' ruling class around the world. So if you understand colonialism as a tactic, then you can understand neocolonialism as a tactic. And the reason why Kwame Nkrumah calls it the last stage is because we went through a point in history where all these imperialist powers were like outright colonizing nations, were exerting visible foreign dominance of nations all over Africa, all over Central and South America, all over the Western Hemisphere. It was like Europeans controlling indigenous peoples, African peoples on their own land visibly. And in place after place after place where this was the paradigm, we saw armed struggles of national liberation to overthrow that particular order, to overthrow the visible foreign domination, to say, you settlers, you colonizers, you cannot be here on our own land telling us what to do, stealing our resources and exploiting us. We should be able to have control of our own destinies as African people, as indigenous people, so we're going to drive you out. Wars of anti-colonialism, of national liberation were fought all over Africa, all over the colonized world, and the result of that is that that particular style of colonialism, where the foreign domination is like in your face, is explicit, was driven out of many, many, many nations, no longer became possible. It no longer became possible for imperialist nations to just go into another country and take over their government and say, we're running you on your own land now. Like the anti-colonial struggles, the revolutionary struggles of colonized nations throughout Africa and throughout the Western Hemisphere made that particular style of colonialism untenable, unworkable in many, many, many places all over the world. It's by no means like completely eradicated, but is now like much less common than settler colonialism or neocolonialism. So understanding that, understand that neocolonialism is a form of colonialism that emerged in response to those struggles of national liberation. The in-your-face foreign domination no longer became possible. And so in its place, imperialist countries, wealthy capitalist countries basically said, we are going to allow you the appearance of independence. We're going to nominally allow you to elect the leadership that you believe you want. We're going to say that your government is free to like do what it wants, but we are going to maintain indirect economic and political control of that nation. You're not going to accept us in your face running your shit. And so instead, we're going to have someone that looks like you, that you think is on your side, running the shit. But in reality, that person reports to us. On paper, you have independence, but in reality, the country is still controlled economically, politically by the wealthy capitalist nations, by the imperialist nations. And actually, Honduras, again, is a clear example of this, because the person that is in power now, the dictator, is a Honduran national. He grew up there, he was born there, he is a Honduran person. He was nominally elected through a process, election process that the United States referred to as free and fair, but which within Honduras was very clearly orchestrated, like controlled. Like, I think when they were like doing the count, it looked like one person was winning from Manuel Zelaya party, and then all of a sudden the count stopped, like the lights went out in the voting center, and it was like just out for like a couple of days, and when it came back, the dictator had won. So, and then the United States was like, that was free and fair. But on paper, it looks like that was a Honduran person elected to run the Honduran government in a free and fair election. But in reality, like I said, that dictator is basically almost entirely propped up by the U.S. empire. The U.S., for all intents and purposes, controls the Honduran government, although by every appearance, Honduras is an independent nation. And that's the case for a lot of places. That is the dominant paradigm in Africa today. We have governments that are led by African people, African men in most cases, governments that may even talk about being free nations, sovereign nations, but which in reality are extremely beholden to not just the U.S. empire, but also U.S. corporations, European nations, and European companies as well. So neocolonialism is the appearance of independence, but in reality, all of the internal affairs of that nation, the political and economic life of that nation, is controlled by the foreign power. So it's like on paper independence, in reality continued subjugation and domination. Nkrumah Ture on YouTube is shouting out Lenin, who defined imperialism. Correct. Also, Lenin defined imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, by Kwame Nkrumah, is a place where you can read more about how I'm saying Nkrumah defined neocolonialism. So once again, neocolonialism became the dominant strategy, the dominant form of colonialism on the planet when anti-colonial struggles destroyed the viability of the old form of colonialism, where it was in-your-face foreign domination. So in a lot of ways, neocolonialism only emerged because of the resistance struggles of oppressed people. Neocolonialism was like a desperate response on the part of the ruling class of the capitalist nations, who needed to maintain control of us, needed to maintain control of these countries that had fought their independence, but were no longer able to do it in the old way anymore. So neocolonialism is a sign of a system that is like at its like ending point, basically. It's like the last place that capitalism can go, the last place that imperialism can go. That's why neocolonialism refers to it as the last stage of imperialism. Lenin, so Monique is asking who defined it as the highest or last stage of capitalism, and Vladimir Lenin of the USSR and also Kwame Nkrumah both described it as that. And it's for the reason I said. It's because oppressed peoples, colonized peoples, when faced with foreign domination, when faced with colonization, are going to resist. There's never been a point in history where people have not resisted that. And so neocolonialism is like, it's basically just trying to hide what they're doing by allowing the appearance of independence while we are still controlled, because they know they cannot outright take our independence anymore. They know we're not going to accept in-your-face foreign domination. So this is their last try at hiding what they're doing while still maintaining control of us. And Nkrumah Ture is like, yep, it's a sham government. So neocolonialism, speaking on neocolonialism, is a sham government or a puppet government in place, or more simply, it is white supremacy and blackface. Correct. That is an extremely good way of putting it. There's like a really good meme I love where colonialism is, it's like like when European colonizers came to Africa, they wore like those hats that had like the pointy thing on top. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. And like the safari outfits, and there would be like pictures of them like riding African children because they were like barbarians. But so there's like a picture of like a European wearing like one of those outfits, and he's holding a chain, and the chain is around the neck of an African person. So it's a European colonizer holding an African person on his chain, and the label is colonialism. And then on the other side of the picture, there's an African person in a suit holding a chain, and that chain is tied around another African person's neck. And it's labeled neocolonialism. So colonialism is when the European is in your face, the colonizer is in your face by running your shit. And neocolonialism is when they get an African in a suit, a person that looks like you, to hold the chain for them. That is neocolonialism. There's a really good fan quote talking about there's like a certain segment of African people where if a cracker plays music in Paris, the Africans in Cameroon dance. It's basically just African people consenting to be puppet leaders for foreign powers. That is what neocolonialism is. Barack Obama, we talked about neocolonialism at length in the last show, so remember I said Barack Obama is a really clear example of a neocolonial leader. He is an African man, but he very gladly stood in the position of leadership within the US empire and used that position to colonize Africa and steal wealth from African people in the United States. He very clearly used that position to give tanks and weapons to militarized police that are now using that equipment to brutalize the African people and the folks that are in solidarity with us in the streets. Barack Obama was a willing African face for the white supremacist American empire and used his position and his identity to extend the influence of that empire and to consolidate control over African people while telling us to our faces that we were free. So Barack Obama is an example of one of those puppet leaders. The blackface or the white supremacy in blackface, like Barack Obama is like the embodiment of that. Perhaps like the highest expression of that African people in the United States have seen. I'm very confident in saying that actually, yes, he was the highest expression of neocolonial leadership that African people in the United States have seen, but he is by no means the only one that does that. And work study, so every Aprp chapter has work study every 2 weeks, where for 3 hours we learn and read together, learn about colonialism, learn about capitalism, learn about imperialism. And so at the last work study meeting, we were talking about like sellout leaders among the African community in the United States, people like Keisha Lance Bottoms, who is mayor of Atlanta, who is being considered for the Biden administration to lead, I believe, HUD, the housing department. And she oversaw the massive transfer of wealth from the masses of poor African people in Atlanta to a very small strata of rich African people in Atlanta who are bourgeois and petty bourgeois. She also oversaw the gentrification of that city, the pushing out of poor working class African people. And during the uprising in the summer for George Floyd, Keisha Lance Bottom sent the police, the militarized police in Atlanta, on African youth and working class people who were just out there for justice. And then she ordered that Black Lives Matter be painted before the city hall on the street, because she is a neo-colonial leader. She uses her position to sell out and exploit African people, to line us up to get knocked down by capitalism. But because she looks like us, we're told that she represents the embodiment of our political aspirations, that she represents some kind of independence for us. There's so many people like that. That is the dominant form of leadership that African people have today, both in Africa and in the snakes and throughout the Western Hemisphere. We have neo-colonial leadership. We have black faces for white supremacy playing in our face, talking about I'm just like you, as they sell us out, as they make sure that the foreign dominator, the ruling class, can maintain control of us and exploit us. So as neocolonialism is once again white supremacy in a black face, and it is best understood as a tactic of imperialism, as a tactic of global capitalism. So hopefully that was clear. I appreciate y'all. I feel like I can tag team this with the people in the comments and me. So I appreciate y'all. So yeah, Monique was saying those are two good examples of neocolonialism, referring to Barack Obama and Keisha Lance Bottoms. Stephanie says maybe this is for another time. But is the propaganda against Cuba comparable to the narrative against North Korea and Soviet Russia? I know I have more to study on this, but I admit I have an aversion to it because of what I read. Yes, it is comparable. It absolutely is. We have to understand that we are living in not only a capitalist country, but also the largest, most dangerous, and most expansive empire that has ever existed in the history of the world. An empire that has military bases on every continent. An empire that seeks to control the resources and political and economic life of the majority of the life on Earth. Like the US government is currently sanctioning 1/3 of the Earth's population. So yeah, understanding that, we also have to understand that any project, any struggle within any nation that seeks to have the affairs and resources and labor of that nation controlled by the people of that nation represents a threat to the interests of the US empire, which means even if a country like 1,000 miles away, like across the world, it's like we would like to be socialist, the United States considers that a threat. And so whenever a nation, whether it be the USSR, whether it be Cuba, whether it be North Korea, decides to take, or Vietnam, decides to take that step towards liberation, towards socialism, towards taking capitalism off its teeth, picking off the leash of imperialism and capitalism, the United States is going to do everything it can to attack that nation, to demonize that nation, to spread lies about that nation. Like, that is why, to this day, the US government has listed Venezuela as a direct threat to security interests of the United States, a direct threat, like a terrorist threat to the safety of the United States. Venezuela, minding its own business, trying to nationalize its oil, trying to build socialism, just being helpful and nice. It's just like over here in South America, thousands of miles away. And the US government is like, this country that's minding its own business and trying to build socialism is a direct threat to our safety. And that's because, for precisely what I said, every single time a colonized nation or a subjugated nation moves to win its independence, moves to build self-determination, the United States is going to consider that a threat. And so that is precisely why the majority of what we hear about socialist countries, the majority of what we hear about the USSR and North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela and so many other places is negative, is because the United States is trying to inoculate us against those struggles, turn us against the liberation struggles of those peoples. So I openly admit that I have not studied a lot about the USSR. I read Imperialism. I've read I read about the history. I read Stalin on the national question, but I don't know a lot about the history of the USSR. The focus of my historical study is on the Caribbean and Central and South America and Africa, because those are the contexts that are most relevant to me and the liberation struggles that I learned the most from. But I don't know a lot about the USSR, but I do know that capitalism lies 100% of the time. And so when I hear things about how the Soviet Union was supposedly organized, or how it was a dictatorship, or how people was oppressed, even if I don't know all the details, I know that it's very likely a bunch of bullshit. I know that the very same sources that are telling me that North Korea is oppressing its own people are the same sources that are lying about African people on TV on a constant basis, lying about Cuba on TV on a constant basis. Like, I know quite a bit about Cuba now. And so whenever I hear people talk about Cuba on CNN, I listen, and it's like nothing but constant lies, What were they watching? What were we watching? Oh yeah, we were watching this really weird movie last night called, it's called 3 Billboards. It starts like Sam Rockwell and Woody Harrelson. It's about this lady who puts up billboards because her daughter was murdered or whatever. But it's just like a movie about like some European people's lives. And it's like a small town. It's very strange. I didn't care for it. But there was a part in the movie where they were just randomly like threw Cuba under the bus. Like there was like this queer character, and the Sam Rockwell character was like, like kill people like you in Cuba. And I was like, what? That's not true. Even when Cuba was homophobic, there was a period in history where Cuba, like every other nation, was homophobic. But they never fucking kill people for being gay. Ever. And then once Fidel Castro realized how reactionary homophobia was, he apologized on state television, and they reversed entirely their homophobic policies. And right now, 2020, if you are a trans person, for example, you can get free gender confirmation surgery in Cuba. There are queer and LGBTQ organizations and state leadership in Cuba. Cuba is not anti-gay. But this movie, it's about like a fucking town in Missouri. Out of nowhere, it was like Cuba hates gay people that kill them. I was like, damn. Like, that's like the kind of narrative that we get in the United States about socialist countries. It's like nothing but like constant lies. So like I said, I don't really know a lot about the USSR, but I do know that the majority that I hear about the USSR and North Korea is some bullshit. I feel like it's a really good strategy when living in imperialist countries, when living in capitalist countries, to take anything you hear about any socialist country with a grain of salt. Just assume it's bullshit. Just assume it's bullshit. And then with North Korea specifically, a similar situation, right? Like I said, my studies focus on Central America and South America and Africa and the Caribbean. But Black Hammer is an organization that we work with quite a bit that's made up of nothing but colonized peoples united around the same objective of liberation. So no Europeans, just colonized peoples. And there's a comrade in Black Hammer who's Korean who made this video where they just basically, they're from North Korea, where they just like talked about the truth about North Korea. I'm like trying to look it up as I'm talking to y'all. But when I watched that, I was like, wow, everything I know about this is not true. All the things I've heard are not true. Actually, I just found it, so I'm gonna put it in the chat. So yeah, it's again a comrade from Black Hammer who is North Korean, who is Korean, talking about the reality of North Korea. So let me see the points that she talks about, or they talk about. So they talk about why the North Korea is developed by necessity such a strong centralized government, why it is nonsensical for any colonized person to buy into propaganda about North Korea, why dispelling takes that the leadership of North Korea is a monarchy and North Korea is authoritarian. So yeah, check it out, the video in that channel. And like I said, this person is like from there, and is a revolutionary fighting for liberation in the United States. And I watched that and I was like, oh my God, I know nothing. All the things I've heard seem to just be bullshit. I had that same experience with Cuba and I like confirmed it. But yeah, I would say like practice healthy skepticism when you hear negative narratives about socialist or anti-imperialist countries in the United States. Because the United States has a vested interest in you distrusting and hating those countries. They want you to demonize and dehumanize the people of those nations. They want you to be suspicious of those nations so that when the US government attacks them, you will be on their side, on the side of the government, and not on the side of the oppressed people. So always be skeptical about anything you hear from US sources about a socialist country or an anti-imperialist country. Always. This is a very good policy. Just assume it's bullshit. And then someone's asking, is Stacey Abrams considered neo-colonialist? I heard you say this a while ago, but I'm having trouble understanding why. So Stacey Abrams is another example of a neo-colonial leader. Absolutely. Stacey Abrams is a Zionist. So Zionism is the political ideology of the Israeli settler colonization of Palestine. It is the ideology that they use to justify stealing Palestinian land and committing genocide against Palestinian people. Stacey Abrams is a politician in Georgia who has a position in favor of Israeli genocide against Palestinian people. That right there on his face is an indication that something is wrong right there, right? Because why would this African woman in state leadership in Georgia need to have a position on the struggle on Israel and Palestine? And further, if we understand, as I said, that the US only became a global power, only became an empire, thanks to the theft of indigenous land through the process of European colonialism and the enslavement of indigenous people for us to work that land, then on what basis would she, if she was a revolutionary African person or an African person who was on our side, would she co-sign that same process happening to another people? Beyond that, Stacey Abrams is part of the same machinery of privatization and of pushing poor and working class African people out of the cities of Georgia that Keisha Lance Bottoms is a part of. Stacey Abrams is a gentrification candidate. Stacey Abrams is a pro-imperialism candidate. Stacey Abrams, after the election where Georgia, it looks like it's going to go to Biden, was somehow single-handedly given credit for those efforts. But Stacey Abrams worked with Republicans in the state of Georgia to disenfranchise poor working class African people. She helped them redistrict in Georgia in such a way that thousands of African people were disenfranchised. And then she got credit for the organizing of dozens of organizations to register people to vote in Georgia after she had previously sold those people out. So Stacey Abrams is just like a run-of-the-mill, like neoliberal Democrat, like a Zionist, like a gentrifier, like a neocolonial leader, like beholden to private corporations. Like, she's not different. I don't really understand why the narrative is that she's different, because you can very clearly like read about her background, read about her political history, and see that she has never actually been progressive. Like, she is in many ways to the right of Joe Biden as a person. I'm actually looking at this article that The Intercept published about her support of Republican redistricting efforts that disenfranchise African people. So y'all can see what I'm talking about. Like, she's getting credit for being a champion of African people's voting rights, but politically, like historically speaking, she has coordinated with the people trying to strip us of access to those voting rights. So it's just very remarkable to me that she is considered as anything other than a sellout, because she's very open about being one. I think the only reason people are confused about who she is because of representation, because she's an African woman, and people just assume that African woman means progressive, but nope. So this is the article I'm talking about. And I'm also going to find an article about her Zionism. And it's very interesting to me how you can tell when a politician has international, like aspirations of national leadership, aspirations of being like either president or holding national office of some kind. You can always tell because they come out for Zionism. There's like no way that you can hold national office in the United States without being a Zionist, without being pro-Israel stealing Palestinian land. And so that's like a very key way to tell that that someone has national political aspirations in the United States, is that they completely sell out Palestinian people. And that's how I knew that this lady was gonna eventually go for national office. Whew. I don't care for Stacey Abrams. I actually know there's like this whole, I talked about it last week on the show, there's like this whole squad of African, petty bourgeois African women who are basically occupying all sorts of positions of leadership within the system of neocolonialism, who are using those positions to sell out their people, and who who are like held up as like black girl magic, who are like celebrated on the basis of their identity, who are said, because of they are advancing as individuals, are said to be like advancing the struggle of the liberation of our people. Meanwhile, they're only in those positions because they're willing to sell out their people. And people are not paying attention to what they're actually doing. They're just looking at their bodies and being like, I celebrate her. Like Kamala Harris is another one, Susan Rice, Michelle Obama, Beyonce. Like there's all these African women who can only exist as entities by selling out the rest of us. And people hold them up as examples for us. And I find it very frustrating. That's a revolutionary African woman. But this is the article where Stacey Abrams not only comes out as a proud Zionist, but conflates Judaism with Zionism, which is anti-Semitic. She calls BDS anti-Semitic, all kinds of shit. So yeah. That's why I believe Stacey Abrams is a neocolonial leader, and that's why I do not care for her as a person. I'm not going to say anything misogynist, but I don't care for her. Okay. Can we consider the actions the USA took against Gaddafi as an act driven by imperialism? 100%. So for folks that don't know, Gaddafi was the last leader of Libya when it was a free nation. Libya was previously one of the richest and most stable nations on the African continent. It had nationalized resources, and it used the wealth generated from the nationalization of those resources and their selling of them on the global stage to make sure that every person in Libya, for example, had access to housing and education and the things they needed to survive. Like it was one of the richest and most stable African countries, and the wealth of that nation was used for the good of its people under the leadership of Gaddafi. And of course, famously under Barack Obama, that free and wealthy African nation was destroyed. The US invaded Libya, overthrew and lynched Gaddafi, took him out of leadership, and now Libya is basically a failed state, extremely unstable. There's straight up open air slave markets where African people throughout the continent who are trying to migrate to Europe are kidnapped and sold. There are terrorist organizations contesting for power. There is all kinds of puppet US leadership and puppet leadership of other European nations contesting for power in Libya. They went from being an extremely stable, wealthy, and happy place to a new nightmare on the African continent. And the reason why the US government overthrew Gaddafi is that Gaddafi was a threat to the interests of Western imperialism in Africa. Gaddafi was a Pan-Africanist who funded liberation struggles throughout the African world, throughout the continent and throughout the diaspora. Libya was a liberated zone where revolutionary African forces could gather and meet each other and build. It was one of the last liberated zones on the African continent. And because it was such a wealthy nation, and because Gaddafi was a Pan-Africanist, he had a vision for Africa in which there would be a single African currency that was backed by African resources, that was backed by Libyan gold. One thing to understand about currency in Africa is that it is controlled, for the most part, by Western powers. For example, there is a section of Africa known as Francophone Africa that is made up of African countries that are colonized by France, that are subjugated by France, that straight up, for a very long time, were forced to use French currency within their nations. And additionally, were forced to send a segment of their GDP, to send a segment of the wealth of their nations to France to be held in French banks. And this happened after those nations were supposedly independent. France is the second, has the second most military bases in Africa. The United States is number one, France is number two. And France has controlled the currency of African nations, and France has controlled a portion of the GDP of African nations. Actually, the president that France's international airport is named for, his name is Charles de Gaulle. It's de Gaulle Airport. That dude straight up said that without the colonization of Africa, France would not be a global power. France would not exist as an entity without the resources it stole from Africa. So Gaddafi comes around And he was like, we need an African currency backed by African resources. And France was like, say what? We don't want that. We want control of your wealth. We want control of your resources. We want you to be subordinate to us. If you have a currency that's backed by your own resources, we can't have that anymore. And so they worked with the United States, they worked with NATO to overthrow Gaddafi, to make sure that there could never be a hint of independence for those African nations. So absolutely, the overthrowing of Gaddafi could be understood as an act of imperialism. And it's also an example of how imperialism works to demonize leaders that it's targeting, because in the run-up to the US invasion of Libya and to the overthrowing and again lynching of Gaddafi, there's a video of him being murdered by a mob, and it's extremely barbaric. There's a video. So yeah, he was lynched. And so in the run-up to that happening, they spread straight up lies about Gaddafi. They called him a dictator. They said he was oppressing his own people. They made up lies. Like there was one really wild lie where they said he was like hiring mercenaries and giving them Viagra and like sending them out to rape people. They like straight up made it up. Like that never happened. They were just making up all kinds of wild shit, all like repeating it over and over and over again on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and the New York Times, like build up a consensus that Gaddafi was a murderer, so that when they went in and lynched him and overthrew the government that the Libyan people wanted, the people in the United States were like, oh, you're helping them. Oh, you're by making sure that they can't have their own currency and destroying the one wealthy, stable African nation in Africa, you're helping them. That it was the whole purpose of that messaging that Gaddafi was a monster, was to make sure that you people in the United States would see what the US military was doing, see what NATO was doing and support it. And there's people to this day where if you say Gaddafi are like dictator, who do not know anything about him, who do not know what Libya was like, who then don't know what it's like now, probably heard about him for the first time on CNN, but you could not tell them that he is not a monster, that he was not a dictator, that the US did not do the right thing. So yeah, that's part of the process of imperialism, right? Where in order to maintain political and economic control of the targeted country, if a leader is in power who is not going to be amenable to maintaining the relationship of domination, they demonize that leader in order to justify overthrowing them and replacing them. Same shit actually happened to Zelaya in Honduras. And I remember reading about this and getting so angry. Like in the run up to the coup, there was all these stories in US media about how Zelaya was authoritarian, about how the Constituent Assembly, which again was going to be assembly of oppressed peoples in Honduras to have representation within government. They're talking about how that was authoritarian, how he was trying to like extend power, all that shit. Same thing happened to Morales. Same thing happened to Hugo Chavez. Of course, happened to Fidel Castro. Happened to Mugabe. Basically, anytime there's like a leader or a government or a party in power in a colonized nation that doesn't want to play ball with imperialism, imperialism works overtime in the media and in the news to demonize that leader in the eyes of the Western world so that they can be pushed out and replaced with someone who's going to be a willing puppet. So, yep. Makes me so angry. It's like so, yeah, and people in the United States, I posted about this yesterday on Facebook, like people in the United States have no concept of this process unfolding around the world. Like I said, the United States is like the biggest, most expansive, most dangerous empire in the history of the planet. But if you were to watch a presidential election from the outside, you would think that the US was not, like, they don't talk about foreign policy. They don't talk about the empire. They talk about domestic shit and they talk about like culture war shit. I have like the last presidential debate I watched, they were just like fighting about who loves the police more. Meanwhile, like I said, the United States has military bases in every single continent. They have hundreds of military bases all over the world. No other nation has that going on. They have sanctioned 1/3 of the Earth's population. They have extended the influence of the US empire to every corner of the globe. But the majority of the people who nominally elect the government in the United States not only do not know about this, but also don't care to know. Do not care, are not aware of it, get bored when you talk about it. All they really care about, all they hear on the news, this person over there is bad, we're gonna bomb them. And they're like, that seems reasonable to me. And they like, keep it pushing. It's very wild how little voters in the United States care about imperialism. Like even Bernie Sanders, who I mentioned, at first I compared Man Was a Lion Honduras to Bernie Sanders, and then I said, wait, Man Was a Lion is anti-imperialist, but Bernie Sanders is not. Like Bernie Sanders' whole shtick was domestic improvements to improve the lives of people living in the United States. some people, and then also absolutely no criticism or proposed changes whatsoever for the mechanisms of US imperialism. Like, he was like, I'm good with sanctions, I'm good with drones, Venezuela's a dictatorship. Like, he was going like lockstep with the US empire's policies of foreign domination. Lockstep. He was solely focused on domestic affairs, and all of these people who say they are progressive, who say they are left, were like, this is good with me. Like, you would like to continue droning and sanctioning people, then I accept that if I get healthcare. And if that healthcare is paid for by stealing from the majority of their population, that's fine with me. I would just like, I'm not mad about what's that Dave Chappelle joke? I'm not mad about the theft, I'm mad about the cut. Like, they weren't mad about the process of looting from people, they were mad they were not getting a cut. I feel like that's what Bernie Sanders embodies as a person, because he was, again, someone who had progressive domestic policies but had no criticisms whatsoever of US foreign policy. When it came to voting to sanction a country, bomb a country, invade a country, he was always there being like, I agree. What are y'all saying? Let me see. Personally, I don't think Gillum nor Abrams fully understand what they're giving their allegiance to. That's not to say they wouldn't if they actually knew Zionist history. I don't know if I believe they don't understand. I don't know if I believe they don't understand. But also, it doesn't really matter if they understand or not, because they're using the positions they have to provide not just like ideological and political support for Zionism, but also to like push its agenda forward, to push the agenda of Western imperialism in occupied Palestine forward. And were they to win those positions of national leadership, which for Andrew Gillum is probably like off the table entirely for reasons that are his own fault, but if they were able to achieve those positions of national leadership, they would absolutely continue doing that shit. So whether or not they know what they're doing, it doesn't really matter. They're still hurting Palestinian people. They're still hurting indigenous people. Like, who cares? I don't mean to be rude, but like, I don't think it matters. Like, they're like, okay, I have to co-sign genocide against the Palestinian people to achieve power. Co-signed. Like, I don't care if you know why that's bad or not. You're still doing it. Fuck off. What happened? Oh yeah, so yeah, Gaddafi was overthrown by the Obama administration. The Obama administration was one of the most effective imperialist U.S. presidential administrations in like the history of the U.S. Like, he was such an effective imperialist, and the fact that people think that Joe Biden is going to represent something better for the planet is very, like, he's filling his cabinet with people from the Obama administration and people from the Bush Jr. administration, and Joe Biden himself has an extensive history of extremely strategic U.S. imperialist advancement around the world. Like, he was one of the main cheerleaders for the illegal war in Iraq that overthrew, that plunged that country into chaos and killed millions of people. Like, he was one of the main people pushing for that to happen because he understood what that would have meant for the wealth of the U.S. empire. So Joe Biden is a much more effective imperialist than Donald Trump. Joe Biden is the architect of Plan Colombia, which drove mass migration to the U.S., which is why the Obama administration was putting people in cages. Joe Biden is going to represent much more effective U.S. imperialism than Trump, and people are lying to themselves if they think he's better. Ricky's asking, can someone point me to the link of the Black Hammer member from North Korea talking? I will drop that link in the comments again. Again, this is Seo Hammer from Black Hammer, who is from Korea, talking on the DPRK. And the DPRK is another name for North Korea. I think it's Democratic People's Republic of Korea is what it stands for. Cool. Wow, those Frenchies are brutal. Yeah, France is a prolific colonizer. Prolific colonizer of Africa, prolific colonizer of Asia. They attempted to colonize the United States. They, of course, were the colonizers of Haiti that were overthrown by the Haitian Revolution. France is a colonizer from way back. France is also racist and Islamophobic and white nationalist, like, to this day. Like, actually, France is a really good example of why electing Joe Biden to defeat the so-called fascism of Trump was like a really, really, really bad strategy, because Macron, the current leader of France, I don't know how to say that in the France way, I don't know if I can care, but it's Macron, the current president of France, was supposed to be the anti-fascist alternative to Marine Le Pen, who was like an open white nationalist. He was very far right. So it was like her up against Macron. Macron won. People were like, we can't have this far right lady over in power, so let's go with this guy, the neoliberal. And now France is like trying to stomp out Islam within its borders, is like basically engaging in programs, engaging in a demonization of Arabic and African peoples within its borders. It's getting like really hyper white nationalists to drive out foreign peoples in France. Like Macron is going like full fash as a so-called response to terrorism. And so yeah, I feel like people, y'all are gonna learn the hard way that there is no, like, neoliberalism is not an anti-fascist alternative to anything. Neoliberalism is the precursor and precondition for fascism. Y'all about to learn. Joe Biden's gonna show you, and Macron already showed you. And if US voters paid attention to foreign policy, that probably would have been a more useful lesson. The Francophone countries are still using the CFA and still hold their reserves in France in 2020. Shaking my head. Yep, so France's history of colonization in Africa is not discussed enough, but France would not exist as a global power without the exploitation of Africa. It's just on period. And Charles de Gaulle himself admitted that. Yeah, Stephanie speaking on Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams and whether or not they know how bad Zionism is, says intention doesn't separate impact. Same goes with colonial efforts but personal aspirations, right? Yeah, like, I mean, even if they don't understand Zionism, which again I find hard to believe, they are like, Israel is straight up committing genocide against Palestinian people on their own land, openly, and then demonizing those people for fighting back. And so when you co-sign that, even if you don't understand like the intricacies of, like, I don't know, imperialism, that you understand very clearly, people are getting their land stolen and killed. But even if for some reason you're confused about that being bad, you can understand that if you allow wealthy people and businesses to control all of the lands in a city with a majority African population, that you're going to push poor working class African people out. Like, that's very obvious. You must understand that if you fund police that have a history of terrorizing African and colonized people, that those police are going to continue to terrorize African and colonized people. Like, you have to understand that the domestic policies that you are supporting are having a negative impact on all but a very small section of your people. So like, Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams get like no benefit of the doubt from me because they could not occupy those positions without very visible exploitation and oppression of their own people. So even if they're like confused about what's happening in Palestine, which I don't believe they are, they can still very clearly see the impact of their actions and the policies they support on their own people here, and they still do that shit. So yeah, enemies of the people to me. AFRICOM bases exist in 53 out of 54 African nations, yet so-called USA political progressives are okay with that because at its core, the US empire is dependent on imperialism. Yep, that's precisely the case with Bernie Sanders. That's why Bernie Sanders is not anti-imperialist. Because Bernie Sanders, people would always be like, Bernie Sanders, how do we pay for Medicare for all? How do we pay for it? How do we pay for it? And if I was Bernie Sanders, I would have been like, look at the US military, like, take it from there, shit. Like, there's more than enough to pay for health insurance for everybody if we take money from the US military. But Bernie Sanders never fucking said that. He just talked about different kinds of taxes and shit, taxing the wealthy, well-spending for share. He never at any point was like, we can take resources from what we're doing to control their nations and use it to make people's lives better here. Because Bernie Sanders understood very clearly that the domestic policies he was advocating for, the better safety net that he was advocating for within the United States would need to be funded by the US empire's imperialist interventions abroad. He understood very clearly the wealth generated by US imperialism could be redirected towards social programs. He had no intention of stopping that relationship. He again just wanted to improve the cut. And for that reason, Bernie Sanders was not a socialist. He may call himself a socialist. He definitely created a lot of confusion about what socialism is, but all Bernie Sanders was really doing was trying to give capitalism a way out that wasn't going to be straight up fascism. He was like, instead of like trying to brutally repress people, why not just give them a bigger cut to get their buy-in within this system? He was basically giving capitalism a release valve. And it was actually very illuminating that even though he was trying to help them, the ruling class was like, no, fuck you. We want it all. We want to give up nothing. Fuck these people. Like, get out of our faces. He was trying to save capitalism. The ruling class was like, we will give up nothing. And yeah. So yeah, when Bernie people, yeah, he was not U.S. progressives never challenge imperialism. Same thing with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Like, she has all kinds of like common sense ideas for progressive domestic policies. But when you look at how she talks about Venezuela, when you look at how she talks about Bolivia, when you look at how she talks about Iran, when you look at how she talks about any targeted country of U.S. imperialism or U.S. imperialism itself, she's not saying anything different from the most war hawkish Democrats, from any other, like any progressive Democrat foreign policy is indistinguishable from regular ass war hawk Democratic foreign policy. They always vote the same when it comes to exploiting and invading and subjugating other countries. They have no criticism of that because they understand very clearly the relationship to what they want to do domestically and the wealth generated by that those fucking actions. So AOC to me is the same shit. I feel like AOC and the squad are just a way to keep more people trapped within the Democratic Party, to give people hope that it's somehow going to be different because the faces in charge are different. But you can always tell who these people actually are when you see how they talk about imperialism. Because imperialism on its face is wrong. It is wrong. It is wrong to attempt to violently exert control over nations that are just trying to live free. Like, every single nation should have the right to determine its own destiny. But under imperialism, a handful of nations, with the US being first and foremost, control the destiny of everybody else through violence and subterfuge. It is on its face wrong. There is no angle by which that is okay to do. So if you are actually a person who believes in social justice, if you are actually a person who believes in like freedom and like liberation and all that kind of shit, then you would not be okay with that. But if you ask Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez about Venezuela, she's gonna say the same motherfucking shit as Joe Biden. Because she does not challenge imperialism. She does not see it as wrong. She accepts it as part of the existence of the United States. She understands that what she's asking for domestically is funded by that shit internationally. So yeah, man, we need better heroes. We need heroes that don't compromise about Zionism, that won't sell out their own people, that don't co-sign U.S. imperialism. Like, to me, like, that should be the deciding factor. I feel like people are so willing to compromise when it comes to oppressing other countries. They're like, it doesn't affect me, so I can roll with this as long as I get something for myself. And that's not cool. That's not cool. That's not believing in social justice. If you're like, I accept the U.S. empire fucking dominating other countries, so it's better inside the empire. No, like, we need better heroes, man. I remember there was a time when there was no African leader, or like the leaders that we respected the most, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, like Huey P. Newton, like Assata Shakur, like who were clear about that being wrong, clear. And now in 2020, we have people like Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like all these motherfucking people who accept on its face this dominating relationship the United States has with the rest of the world, have no intention of changing it, and are held up as believing in social justice. That is bananas. That's wild to me. Anyway, I'm not comment saying if you go to Senegal today, everything is owned by France, and all the people hate France and hate Macron. Very eye-opening. They're also drone bombing Mali, correct? Like, France is saying they're engaged in all kinds of counter-terrorism operations in Africa. The same justification they're giving for the Islamophobic and anti-African and anti-Arabic actions within France are saying it's to fight terrorism. But all that is a pretext to maintain control of these African nations that France is bombing, to maintain control of the internal colonized populations within France. They say it's about fighting terrorism. It's really about looting Africa and looting from colonized peoples. Lane Jammer and Monique just giving some love back and forth. Love to see it. Love to see it. Left squad. Monique is saying the squad is the facade. I agree. Actually, okay. So there's two of them. Let's have some nuance, even though it's no nuance in November. So there's like two people in the squad. There's Ilhan Omar, and there's the Palestinian woman Rashida Tlaib, and they're actually anti-imperialist. They get like much less shine than Ayanna Pressley or AOC, but Ayanna Pressley and AOC are Zionists and not anti-imperialists. But Ilhan Omar is from Somalia, as a refugee from Somalia, and Rashida Tlaib is Palestinian. So Rashida Tlaib is anti-Zionist. I remember when Joe Biden won, she was on Twitter talking about, what are you gonna do with Palestine, Joe Biden? Like, just like going hard for like the anti-Zionist position. And Ilhan Omar, I became aware of her as a person because she was in a hearing with Elliot Abrams, who's one of the architects of genocidal U.S. foreign policy in Central and South America, and she like called him out She's like, didn't you like fund genocides like throughout Central America? Like, are you gonna do that again if you take office? Like, call them out. It was like a global outrage. So Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib do have some level of anti-imperialist policies, but to me, don't challenge it to the extent that's required to really be said to be progressive. They probably could get there, but I'm not sure. Like, the tendency for people in leadership, especially national political leadership in the United States, to move right. It's to make more and more compromises. So we'll see how they go. We'll see how it turns out. But for now, they are anti-Zionist and they have anti-imperialist positions. Certainly much stronger anti-imperialist positions than either Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like the most prominent member of the squad, or Ayanna Pressley. But they get much less shine because you can't really challenge imperialism that hard in the United States and not expect to be like sidelined. Ilhan has been doing dumb shit too. Yeah, like I've read a little bit about like her policies when it comes to like her district in Minnesota and how they are like for austerity, how they are neoliberal as fuck domestically. So like, yeah, there's contradictions, my friends. There's contradictions. Also, Danny on YouTube is saying, I find it very peculiar that colonized people can identify Republican POCs like Condoleezza Rice, Estella, but not DOC POCs, DNC POCs like Obama, AOC, and Harris. I also agree with that. I remember, I think I talked about this on another show, like how everybody was mad at Ice Cube for like sitting down with Trump. But like meanwhile, like Cardi B can interview Joe Biden, or Beyonce and Jay-Z can endorse Hillary Clinton. And that's like better. Like people don't get mad at that. And I'm like, meanwhile, those people are like fucking like exploiting Africa, colonizing Africa, drone bombing African countries, colonizing African countries. You know what I'm saying? Like they are also like funding police in the United States that are attacking African people with military weapons, also overseeing massive transfers of African wealth, generational wealth away from African people in the United States. So they are also architects of mass incarceration in the case of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. So they are as harmful, if not more harmful to us than Republicans. But for some reason, it's okay for African celebrities and leaders to like co-sign them. And I'm like, why do we all recognize it's fucked up for them to fuck with Trump? But when these people who have done as much or more harm are celebrated, these Africans don't get any shit. That to me shows that we don't actually understand how we came to be in this condition in the United States. That to me actually shows to me that we don't understand that the Democrats, despite the fact that they're held up as like the social justice party or like the oppressed people's party, do not move in our favor. Like we don't understand how the Democrats have fucked us over, despite the fact that like a lot of the people are currently living under Democratic mayors and governors that are gentrifying them and taking the police on them and like mishandling the pandemic and all this kind of shit. Like we're living under Democrats and our conditions are shit, but we still don't recognize that Democrats aren't our friends. And so when celebrities co-sign Democrats, it's fine. But when the same celebrity co-signs Trump, it's like a problem. It's confusion. It's confusion. Yeah, so Karma's saying, we view everything in a vacuum here. There's no way the US won't function as a police state if it's a global military empire. We also talk about ICE and immigration without mentioning imperialism. Yeah, that's like another thing that I've been talking to people about and like been frustrated about, is the idea that the election of Joe Biden was somehow going to be better for like the kids in cages that are constantly name dropped. People were like, we saved them. Like Trump is supposed to be like this monster, despite the fact that the very first family separations, the very first kids in cages happened under the administration of Barack Obama, and Trump just continued it. And even to this day, Barack Obama deported and incarcerated more people in ICE detention than Trump by far. But Trump, the election of Biden was supposed to be like a reprieve from Trump's immigration policies. But like I said, Joe Biden is the architect of Plan Colombia. Joe Biden's policies towards Central and South America helped drive mass migration. The coup in Honduras that I described in detail earlier in the show that happened under Barack Obama, that coup that put in place that dictator was the origin of the migrant caravans of thousands of people fleeing conditions in Honduras that had become unlivable. The reason why those fucking families are being separated, those kids are being put in cages, is because the US has no intention of dealing with the refugee crisis that it created, that its foreign policy created humanely. And so instead, it is creating an increasingly draconian and racist and white supremacist system of immigration. There is never going to be a point where that shit is going to be humane, because the US is not going to let those people into its borders because it's white nationalists, but also because those people, by and large, have an awareness of why they're being forced to flee their homes. They are aware that the United States did that. If those people were allowed in and allowed to build relationships with the oppressed nations within the United States, we would start to work together, and it would be a problem. It would be a problem for the people in power in the United States. They don't want that to happen. They do not need oppressed people across borders uniting against them. So that's why those people are never going to be let in the United States. That is never going to be a situation. The U.S. Immigration policy is going to get more and more violent, more and more barbaric. Joe Biden, if you noticed, has never actually promised to end child detention and family separation. Ever. Actually, if you look at his immigration platform, he very clearly says we have to increase the technology of surveillance and control at the border. We need more cameras, more fences. Like, he has like the carrot of like DACA, right? Which is a very, very small segment of the people trying to immigrate to the United States as DACA recipients. So he says we're going to reinstate that. This very small percentage is going to be treated fine. But then on the other side, he says that we have to make this more militarized and more secure. And if you look at his policy towards Central America, he has every intention of continuing the foreign policy that drove mass migration in the first place. So no, sis, you did not save the kids in cages. Those kids are fucked unless the U.S. empire stops fucking with other countries and stops creating refugee crises all over the world. Unless U.S. foreign policy changes and stops being imperialist, migration to the United States will not stop. And like I said, the United States, the ruling class, are not going to let those people in to give us any ideas, to educate us about what's happening. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. They have no intention of doing it. Not Biden, not anybody. It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. Watch. Remember I said that shit. Yeah. Stephanie is pointing out that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when she first ran for office, ran on a platform that included abolishing ICE. And then afterwards, when people were like, okay, so you meant abolish ICE, right? She was like, no, I don't mean abolish. I think I remember she said, let's get rid of ICE and bring back INS, which if you come from an immigrant family like me, then you know INS is not better than fucking ICE. It's not better than fucking ICE. It's the same shit, sis. She kept walking that shit back. I think she also took out like Palestine solidarity from her platform. Erica's in the comments. Erica confirmed. But yeah, basically after she won, she started walking back all of these like actually leftist positions and like falling in line with the neoliberal consensus from the Democratic Party. All she really advocates for is a stronger safety net in the United States in exchange for exploiting people outside the United States. That's really all she does. And she's like pretty, and she's very like she can communicate ideas clearly. But one thing I've noticed that she does is that she'll take like the left position and then she'll like water it down. Like take out all like the radical elements and like water it down into a way that's gonna be palatable for the ruling class of the United States. And then people are like, oh my God, she's so profound. And I'm like, man, we've been saying this shit. But we've also been criticizing capitalism and imperialism. And she like took that out and said the same thing. And y'all like, oh my God. Like it's so, it's very interesting. Yeah, Monica responding to Stephanie about how AOC walked back from abolishing IS said, she was like, I don't mean abolish, I mean reform. That was the platform. How could I ever trust her after that? I got into this Facebook fight with folks about AOC and her fakeness. She literally within 3 days was like, nah, I meant reform. Meanwhile, the people that had been saying abolish ICE, like they meant abolish ICE. We were saying like literally abolish ICE. We weren't saying reform ICE. Why would you say abolish when you meant reform, sis? Because you were trying to hop on to a radical movement and use it to get into office. And then once you got there, you were like, boop, I'm good on this shit. I don't care for her. I don't care for her. I don't care for Stacey Abrams. I don't care for Kamala Harris. I feel like all these colonized women within this imperialist capitalist government are just like selling people out and getting credit. And it's very gross to me. It's very gross to me. Like revolutionary African and colonized women don't exist. And we're out here doing work. You're celebrating these sellouts, man. And Erica is confirming, yes, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, after she won election the first time, removed support for the Palestinian liberation struggle from her platform, took it off her website. That's what I thought happened. Oh yeah, and then Stephanie is reminding me that AOC during the pandemic at the beginning was like delivering groceries to folks who were impacted by COVID. and she was bringing a police escort to their doors. Like, she was like in the hood in New York, like in Flatbush, in like subsidized housing, knocking people's doors with the police and some groceries. Jesus Christ, girl! Like, what are you doing? Anyway, that was what is imperialism. I talked about what it is. I defined it. I talked about examples. I talked about how imperialism demonizes the targets. They demonize the leadership that doesn't do what they say, and they also demonize the citizens of the targeted countries. Like, that's why there are entire nations, like whenever the United States goes to the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, like people in the United States are just like sand niggers, like, excuse my language, but they're just like, they just like dehumanize the whole population across the board, say they're uncivilized, say they have like ancient beef that can never be resolved because like the mystical religion of Islam. Like, basically just like completely misrepresent them in an extremely racist way. Like, the process of dehumanization that targets the leaders, the process of demonization that targets the leaders is extended to the whole population. Like, part of the reason why AFRICOM was able to extend such a massive military footprint across the African continent, 53 out of 51 nations have some form of US military presence, was one, because Barack Obama was the one that did that. AFRICOM started under Bush, but was drastically expanded under Barack Obama. And because he was the first African president, African people, both in the United States and on the continent, just like kind of let it happen. But also because the impression that US citizens have of Africa is that it's just like one giant charity case that is not capable of getting it together, that is poor because African people don't know how to build nations, that just is in constant need of like charity and help and protection from these nations that are actually looting it. Like, people accept US corporations looting African resources. They accept the US military conquest of Africa because they believe fundamentally that Africans are not capable of running our own lives, of running our own nations, of running our own lands. They just like accept the fact that like these motherfucking like European students on like missionary trips will go to Africa and like somehow teach African people anything about anything. Like, they just accept the fact that Africa is a charity case and that the US is there like out of the goodness of its heart and just like trying to help or whatever, because they have an extremely racialized and dehumanizing idea of African people and of Africa as a whole. Like, that's what imperialism does. It like creates a narrative that justifies the subjugation of these countries by saying there's like some intrinsic quality of the targeted nation that makes the imperialism okay, that the imperialism is actually helping them. Humanitarian intervention, the whole idea that the United States like invades and loots and drones countries to help them, that's another narrative. Like, it's like white savior shit basically on a global scale. Like, that's what humanitarian intervention is. Like, again, if you think about how the United States came to be through the genocide of indigenous nations and the theft of indigenous land and the enslavement of African people and the colonization of Africa, if you think of the violence that was required for the United States to exist in the first place and also for it to continue to exist, the idea that that entity built on that much violence and blood could go anywhere and help anybody is absurd on its face. It is absurd. Like, you literally are killing people to this day, committing genocide against indigenous nations of the Western Hemisphere, to this day, exploiting and brutalizing African people in Africa. But I'm supposed to believe that you are helping Libya, that you are helping Puerto Rico, that you are helping the Philippines. I'm supposed to believe that. You're there to help, even though you could not exist except on top of a pile of bodies? Like, come on now. The only reason that people believe in the concept of humanitarian intervention, the only reason why that shit keeps working as the justification for imperialism, US imperialism, is because people have internalized, racialized, dehumanizing views of non-European nations that say any kind of intervention is justified because we don't know what we're doing, we don't know how to live. Every time someone's like, the same shit happened with with Bolivia, when Evo Morales was overthrown. I remember there was like fucking New York Times articles, Atlantic articles talking about he's authoritarian, patriarchal. I was like, you're writing that from the United States? You're critiquing someone's patriarchy and fucking authoritarianism from the United States? From the United States? Like, first of all, it's bullshit, but also, even if he was, he could never measure up to the patriarchy and authoritarianism of the most dangerous empire that's ever existed. Like, what place does the US have to say shit about anybody? But US citizens, once again, have really internalized the exceptionalism, the saviorism, and the racialized views of the majority of the Earth's population. Y'all have internalized that shit. And so they can just like spout hot bullshit, while they're going over to fucking loot from a country, or control a country, or steal from a country. And people just accept it because they've internalized all the lies. I talked about what happens to the victims. I talked about what happens to the imperialist nations. They grow, they get fat, they loot the world, and they use that wealth to enrich that nation and to extend its power. So imperialism is a bunch of bullshit. And African and indigenous peoples in the United States were imperialism's first targets. And so I just want to conclude this PE section, which is gone for an hour and 45 minutes. I said I wasn't feeling well, and then I just got a second wind, I guess. I want to conclude this section by saying that this system cannot exist without us. The wealthy nations of the world, the imperialist capitalist countries, all of their wealth was stolen from Africa, was stolen from indigenous nations, was stolen from colonized nations. They are, this is no exaggeration, they are a full creation of us, of our resources, of our stolen labor. Everything they are, they stole from us. So understanding that, we must understand that if we were organized to take on this system, would have all of the power in this relationship. We must realize that imperialism is dying as the planet is dying. We must realize that they're becoming increasingly desperate to exploit the planet's resources. And we must, as African and indigenous and colonized peoples, join the fight to put this system into the ground once and for all. They cannot live without our resources, so we must fight for collective control of those resources under socialist societies. We must fight for the liberation of our lands. We must fight for control of our labor. We must fight for collective control of the means of production. That's why they're so scared of nationalizing, because that means the people collectively control their own resources. So we have to join organizations fighting against capitalism, fighting against imperialism. We must unite struggles across borders, and we must engage in a global movement to take out this system once and for all. And that, again, begins with making sure that every single African, indigenous, and colonized person is active in an organization fighting against capitalism, fighting against imperialism. If we are unified and organized, we can take this shit out. It'll be a wrap. It'll be a wrap. And they can't exist without us. They can't exist without us. We take our shit back, this whole thing falls. They know that. We don't, but they do. That's why they work so hard to keep us separated. That's why they work so hard to demonize us. That's why they work so hard to keep us on the bottom, because they understand that if we were to organize and unite, it would be a wrap for them. So let us join organizations fighting for justice. Let us join and be active members of organizations fighting to take out imperialism. Let us connect struggles of oppressed and colonized peoples across borders. Let us do this. Let's take the shit out before they take out the planet, man. They're about to destroy the planet with us on it. And then they're gonna fuck off to space. You want them to do that? You want to fucking deal with Elon Musk talking to you from a satellite on some bullshit while we're living in like fucking over 100-degree heat waves, no fucking food can grow? You want that? You want that future? I don't. I want to fucking take these people out before they fuck off to space. So join an organization fighting for justice, fighting imperialism, unite across borders. Let's take that shit. Let's take our shit back. Take it away from the system. So that was PE section. Join an organization. Let me wrap this up. Let me do it by 2 o'clock so I can do some yoga. So COVID updates. We are, of course, in the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States. Many thousands of people are dying on a weekly basis. I believe it's 9/11 every week. Over 2,000 people every week are dying from COVID-19 within the United States. The majority of those people being colonized people, African and indigenous and Chicano and Filipino people. So it's a serious situation here. And as we see, the leadership is responding by pushing for individual actions, individual intervention. They're saying wear masks. They're saying 6 feet distance. They're saying don't visit your family for Thanksgiving. They're saying no small gatherings. They are focused on the individual response, and they are focused on the vaccine as some kind of magic bullet to resolve this issue. Which, even if the vaccine were the magic bullet that they're riding on, to distribute it to the entire population of the United States is going to take longer than a year. It's not a situation where everybody's going to get this shit within a month and then it's going to be over. Nope. Like, we are still looking at a year plus of dealing with the situation as it presently exists after the vaccine is distributed. So the idea that the vaccine is some kind of magic bullet is really just the people in leadership punting. They are dropping the ball and they are hinging all of their hopes on a possibility, while refusing to make the kind of systemic changes that are necessary to make the situation survivable. Like, individual actions are certainly important. We definitely think that folks need to wear a mask If you're going to be outside your house, like just cover your face, your nose, and your mouth. Cover your face. Wear a mask. You definitely need to maintain that 6 feet distance. You definitely need to avoid gathering inside with other people. Like all that shit's important, but also eat and also stay home if you're able. But also, everybody could do that shit. If it was even possible for everybody to do all that shit, it still would not be enough to avoid these deaths, to avoid the economic impact. And on top of that, even though like the best thing people can do right now is stay home, the fact of the matter is that there are millions of people for whom that is not an option. Because there has been no rent freezes. There has been only one $1,200 check one time. And then unemployment, like additional unemployment that has already ended and is going to end, like the lower number is going to end for millions more people in December. And there's no plan to replace that. So for many people, if they stay home, if they don't go to work, they can't pay their rent or their bills or buy food or pay for healthcare if they somehow get COVID. So they have no choice but to keep going to work, but to keep being outside, but to keep being around other people. And those people are overwhelmingly exploited low-wage workers, so-called essential workers. There's no safety net for them. And so it's not even possible for everybody to do things right because the structural support does not exist to make that possible. So this focus on individual actions, while that structural support is missing, is letting the people in power off the hook. They are directing us to attack each other while completely abandoning us during this pandemic. And if you think that shit's gonna be different under Joe Biden, I encourage you to actually read Joe Biden's COVID plan. It's still on his website. He does not offer anything in the way of increasing access to medical care for poor and working class people. He does not offer anything in terms of long-term rent support for people that are being asked to stay home. He does not offer anything in terms of ongoing stimulus funds for people who are being told not to go to work. Nothing in terms of structural support. He says increase access to the vaccine. He says we're going to hire a deeply inadequate number of contact tracers. He says that we are going to open up all kinds of tasks. He said that we're going to open up a task force to study the racial impact of COVID. We know, bitch. Like, we know. We're dying. What do you need to study, sis? Like, it's just very it's not gonna be better. It's not gonna be different for poor and working class people. The reality situation is that under Trump and under Biden, there will be no structural support. So these people are telling you focus on your individual actions. Don't, if you visit your family on Thanksgiving, you're a piece of shit. But the reality situation is that the leadership is failing. That individual actions can only do so much, and without the structural support, the systemic support, many people are going to be put into a position where they're going to get sick and die that do not have to be in that position. The leadership is failing. You as an individual are not failing. Capitalism is failing, and the ruling class and political class are failing. So stop pointing fingers at your neighbors. The governor of Oregon fucking told people, if you see your neighbors gathering, call the police on them. Who do you think is going to get the police calling them in Oregon? Who do you think is going to be calling the police to report people? And who do you think the police will be called on? Guess. I know you know what I'm thinking. It's going to be African and colonized people. That's what fucking the police are going to show up for these fucking calls. Governor of Oregon is ignoring the structural problems and directing people to attack each other in order to cover up for the failing of the ruling class in the United States. I am begging y'all, do not buy in to this drive to individualize the response to the pandemic. We need to put pressure on the people in power to do the right thing and stop attacking each other. Stop letting these fucking people off the hook, sis. Like, stop. Individual action can only do so much. Even if it was possible for everybody to do the right thing, it wouldn't be enough. So many people don't even have the option of taking those individual actions. Cannot stay home because the structural support does not exist. This is a structural problem. This is a capitalist problem. It is not an individual problem. And yeah, also Biden has straight up said, so there's like a member of Biden's transition team, the coronavirus task force of Biden's transition team, a member of it said, if we shut down the economy for 6 to 8 weeks, we could reverse the course of this pandemic. First of all, it's not enough time. But second of all, like, shutdowns do work. That's just not enough time. And Joe Biden came out last week and was like, no, we're not doing that. He like took it off the table unequivocally. He said, we are not shutting down the economy. Meanwhile, these like rolling reopens, like where they open up outdoor dining and they slowly open up indoor dining. All it really does is like it flattens out the curve for a little bit when everything's closed, and then as soon as things start to reopen, it goes up again. And they're like, why is this happening? It's because you need to shut it down. The controller just shut down fucking economy, pay people to stay home. Like that's what needs to happen. And it's like rolling reopens don't work. But that is precisely what Biden has pledged to do. He is not. He has said we are not going to shut down the economy. A member of his own task force that he appointed floated the idea, and he said no. So people try to tell me it's gonna be better under Biden. I'm like, you are lying to yourself, because you either lying to yourself or you're not actually listening to what this man is saying. Because very clearly saying that it's not gonna be different. It's not gonna be different. So that's COVID updates. Individual actions cannot make up for systemic failures. We must push for a structural response that actually provides people the option to do the right thing, to stay home, because they're paid to stay home, because they have healthcare, because they are provided with food. We need to push for a structural response and not focus on individual pointing of fingers. Like that's just not gonna do anything. I promise you, you're not gonna berate people into being able to stay home when they can't pay their rent, when they have no way to pay their rent. It's just not gonna happen, sis. Anywho, closing of the show, we got 4 minutes. So like I said, we are doing these, oh wait, someone has comments. I see you all talking. Stephanie's talking about space prisons, because when the billionaires fuck off to space, they're still gonna need labor to exploit, and so I'm sure that space prisons are in the works. They can bring up colonized, exploited people, and then like warehouse them. We don't do when they warehouse us, and we don't do what they want. Man, don't let those people fuck off to space and then destroy space. Like either there's like an alien civilization waiting in the wings to fucking blow up Elon Musk's fucking satellite, or it's up to us to stop them from colonizing space. I personally believe that we can't hope for the alien civilization, that we have to do this shit ourselves. We have to make sure that these people do not do the fucking outer space what they did to Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Can you imagine? Like that fills me with such anger and despair, thinking about fucking colonizing space, like the vast expanse of space. Like fuck y'all, man. Leave space alone. It's on us, man. Join an organization so we can stop people from fucking off to space and colonizing the universe. Jesus Christ. Hope is saying, yes, we need to understand the individual struggle versus the collective struggle. The U.S. has more than enough money, resources, and funding for our relatives to live rent-free with food and water and a stipend for everyone. This is the myth of scarcity. U.S. imperialism is exploiting our bodies and labor during this pandemic. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's more than enough wealth in the United States, even without the loot from imperialism, to make sure that everybody can be paid to stay home. They are choosing not to do that because if you see, the wealth of the richest people on the planet is increasing during this pandemic as everybody else is being plunged into poverty and suffering. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, they are getting richer. And that's because the exploitation of our labor and the exploitation of the resources of the earth has not stopped during this pandemic. The reason why the shutdowns are not happening that need to happen is because they need this fucking shit open to keep exploiting our labor, to keep making money. That's the only reason. They want to be able to continue to accumulate wealth while everybody else suffers around them. And if that means that over 2,000 people die every single week in the United States, they accept that as a reasonable consequence of their making more money. It is so wild to me. It is so wild to me how people have been convinced to berate other poor working class people for not doing the pandemic right. Meanwhile, these people are like fucking, they're like dragons sitting on a pile of motherfucking gold coins. It's like hoarding shit, living large on their private islands and jets. While everybody's suffering and we're just yelling at each other, fighting amongst ourselves. That's wild, man. They feel like finesse the fuck out of us. Yeah, Monica's saying on the coronavirus task force to examine the racial impact of the pandemic, there's nothing to study. All they need to do is have a plan to support people's health and economic well-being. Exactly, like it's been clear the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on colonized populations, African people, indigenous people. Like it's been clear. It's been months. Like we know. So at some point, like I feel like the Democrats do this thing where they pretend to care. And they're like, we're going to form a task force. We're going to form a commission. We're going to fund a study. They do that with reparations. Like, we have to study reparations. I mean, it's been hundreds of years. systemic inequality. We understand the problem. So why is more study of the problem required? All they're doing is just like killing time. Like acting like they're doing something and then like not having to ultimately do anything. Saying we're gonna like look at this, we're just gonna study it, we're gonna talk about it, and we're not gonna do anything. No solutions. That is the democratic strategy of pacification, where they like create these task forces, these commissions, these roundtables, these panels, these books, these studies, and nothing ever actually motherfucking happens. They're gonna make that task force, they're gonna study the racial impact of COVID, and be like, damn, that sucks, and they're not gonna do shit. They're not gonna do shit. That's the MO. And y'all keep fucking believing that. You keep buying it. They're playing in your face. Hope says leave space alone. I agree. Don't colonize fucking space. I feel like it's on us to stop them. I feel like it's on us to stop them. I feel like African people have a responsibility to our ancestors and our descendants to liberate Africa, to win Pan-Africanism, one unified socialist Africa. It could be a responsibility to ourselves, people that come before us, people that come after us, and we have a responsibility to the rest of the planet and the rest of the universe, because they are using the resources of Africa, they are looting from Africa to fund imperialist exploitation around the planet and beyond. They are using the resources and land that rightfully belongs to us to maintain this deeply oppressive and genocidal system. And so I feel like we have a responsibility to ourselves, to our ancestors, to our children, and also to the rest of the life that exists to fucking stop this. Like, we have a responsibility. Can't just let that shit happen. Man, if they're able to go to space and colonize it, I'll be very upset. Let me see. So yeah. So that was the show. We've been doing this 101 series on different topics. Last week was what is colonialism? This week was what is imperialism? Next week we are talking about patriarchy. What is it? What is patriarchy? Yeah. So we're gonna be talking about that, explaining patriarchy in detail, giving y'all examples, talking about how to end that shit, fight it. Tune in next Thursday at 12 p.m. Mountain Time. Also, our Conrad in California chapter, Jamu and his daughter Shakura, do their own show every single Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific Time, 5 p.m. Mountain Time. They can watch on the Aprp International YouTube channel, and you can also watch on Ajamu's Facebook page, which is facebook.com/ajamu.umi. We want to thank you so much for tuning into our show, for all of your comments and participation. We appreciate y'all so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, whether you have the day off or not. Please join us next Thursday. Please, if you're not active in an organization, join an organization fighting for justice. Help us stop these people from colonizing space. Okay, have a great day.